Well, let's read in the book of Luke, and we want to read these last two verses in the 13th chapter, verses 34 and 35. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, which kills the prophets and stones them that are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, as a hen doth gather her brood under her wings, and ye would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate, and verily I say unto you, ye shall not see me until the time come when ye shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. This, of course, follows up on the scripture we read last week. Remember the last line here in the 33rd verse, for it cannot be that a prophet perish out of Jerusalem. Someone had warned Christ that Herod was seeking to put him to death, and he asserted that he couldn't be killed until it was time to be killed. And he says, besides, you know, this nation of Israel, they have to kill their prophets in Jerusalem. That had been the usual way, the place where people should go to find God. Instead, they killed the prophets of God. So he says, I won't worry about what Herod can do, because I have to die in Jerusalem. That's the proper place for prophets to die. He says it just couldn't be that a prophet should die except in Jerusalem. And then he has this lamentation, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, which killest the prophets. And of course, he's likening himself to a mother hen. And I remember one time when I heard George Tice preach a sermon on this one verse, verse 34. Many of you know who George Tice is. He's been here several times. He heads up the Word of Life ministry in the northeastern part of Brazil, and he's been down there for 14 years. And before that, for 3 years, he was in the Bible Club ministry here in Central Florida. And there used to be down near Fort Meade a great pile of sand. It was called Sand Mountain, and it was the washings from the phosphate mining. And it was about 200 feet high. In an airplane, you could see it for miles and miles. As a matter of fact, you could be flying up from Miami, and before you ever got to Lake Okeechobee, you could see that bright white spot in the distance. And the kids from all over the area used to love to go and have picnics at Sand Mountain, and they'd climb up that steep incline, you know, and they'd have their weenie roast and so forth, and they just loved that mountain. If you wanted to have an outing, all you had to do was say, we're going to Sand Mountain, and everybody'd want to go. Well, I remember one time I drove a bus, a load of teenagers. George was the Bible club leader, and there was a young man, an 8th grader, in the group that time. He had a high school brother who had been saved in the Bible club ministry, and the high school brother had been praying for him and inveigled him to go on this trip. And we all got up to the mountain. That was back, I don't think I could make it up Sand Mountain now, but I managed to go up with the kids that time. And so they had the meeting right on top of Sand Mountain. And George Tice was preaching, had his testament out, and they were all sitting around, maybe 30 some of them sitting around there. And I remember so graphically his sermon on this verse, and he told a true story of a hen out in the prairies, and she had a little brood of chickens, and there was a prairie fire came sweeping through, and so rather than to try to run and save her life, she just squatted down on the ground and put her wings out and sheltered her little biddies, and the prairie fire came sweeping across, and she was killed, and her feathers were all burned off of her and so forth. But all the little chicks were spared because they were shielded by her body from the sweeping of the fire. And so he made this comparison, because you see, Jesus is making the comparison himself, and he made the comparison there that this is like Jesus. He had to give his life to shelter us from the fires of hell. And then he preached how, and he showed how we would be consumed by the onrushing flames if it weren't for the fact that Christ spread his wings and took the fury of the fire instead of us. You know, he commented on this back in Luke 12. Remember the 49th verse in Luke 12 where he said, I am come to send fire on the earth, and what will I, if it be already kindled? But I have a baptism to be baptized with. He meant a baptism of fire. And I suppose one of the reasons I remember that sermon by George Tice so well is because when he gave the invitation, one young man raised his hand. And then after the meeting, while the rest of them were eating, George took him aside and led him to Christ. And that young man, many of you know, is Hank Alford. He heads up the Bible Club, Word of Life Bible Club ministry now in the state of Indiana, and he has been accepted for overseas duty in South America with Word of Life. But so that has a great impression on me, and I was there when 8th grader Hank Alford was saved on the top of Sand Mountain as a result of hearing a sermon on this one verse of likening Christ to the hen that gathered her brood under her wings. Now let's look at verse 35. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Now, Christ here is speaking to the residents of Jerusalem, and he's quoting a verse from Jeremiah. In the 22nd chapter of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah is prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was considered to be, you might say, an impregnable walled city. Its walls had been attacked by great armies, such as the armies of the Assyrians that had come sweeping down through there and had conquered all the land up to Jerusalem, but they weren't able to capture Jerusalem. And so when Jeremiah kept prophesying that the Babylonians were going to come and take the city stone from stone and destroy the walls and burn the city and ravage the people, they wouldn't believe him. And he said that if you won't go with the Babylonians, you're going to suffer this terrible fate. And so when they wouldn't listen to him, and they reviled him and tried to kill him because of his prophecy, he says, this is what he said in Jeremiah 22:5, your house is left unto you desolate. Now, at the time Christ said this, of course, there was another great wall around Jerusalem, and there was this great temple there. And remember, in the Matthew record, when Christ said this, the disciples were astounded, and they said, well, when are these things going to be? So he's talking about the time when Jerusalem again was going to suffer the same fate that it suffered at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar some 600 years before Christ. And the answer to this prophecy, behold, your house is left unto you desolate, of course, occurred in 70 A.D. when the Roman armies came and took, again, stone from stone and desolated the house or the temple of God. So they understood, or certainly the apostles did, and I'm quite sure that anybody who had any knowledge of the Scriptures would know that he was saying what happened under Nebuchadnezzar is going to happen again, because you killed the prophets as you did then. And just as you tried to kill Jeremiah, and of course that's the time when, as he said, a prophet named Zacharias was stoned between the altar there in the temple gate. And so they knew what he was saying. that he was prophesying that Jerusalem would be destroyed again. And we're going to see where this takes place a little later on in Luke. But we said last week that we wanted to point out three untils. Now, let's read this 35th verse again. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate, and verily I say unto you, ye shall not see me until the time come when ye shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Now, Christ says he's coming again, but three things have got to happen, and both of these, all three of these prophecies are preceded by this word until. Now, one of the things that's got to happen before Christ will come again is that Israel will say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Now, that's a phrase that comes again from the Old Testament, and it's speaking of the time when the nation of Israel will recognize that the Lord Jesus Christ is their king. And if you want to read the phrase, you can find it in Psalm 118, verse 26. Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. That speaks of the time when Israel as a nation will say, Blessed is he. And they'll be speaking of Christ. Now, they didn't say that as a nation when he was here the first time, did they? But that's one of the things that must happen before Christ can reign on this earth. Before he can be king over this earth, he must be received by his own nation. That's one until. Let's look at the other until. The second one is in Luke 21, but I want us to stop for just a moment by Luke 17 so we can see the fulfillment of the prophecy that he gave there. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. In Luke chapter 17, verse 22. And he said unto the disciples, the days will come when ye shall desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man, ye shall not see it. And they shall say to you, See here, or see there, go not after them, and follow them not, for as the lightning that lighteneth out of the one part of the heaven shineth unto the other, so shall the Son of Man be in that day. But first must he suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. This has got to happen. And he's going to be rejected before he's going to be received. Verse 26, And as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. They did eat and they drank, and they married wives. They were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Also, as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, and they built. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. And then it says, in that day this, and in that day so forth and so on will happen. I think I don't have exactly the portion that I wanted. Let's look for a moment on over in 21, chapter 21. Oh, here it is. In Luke 21:20. This is the answer to, Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that its desolation is nigh. Because the way you're going to know that your house is going to be left unto you desolate, when you know it's going to take place, is when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem. Well, this happened, as I said, in 70 A.D. And then let them who are in the Judea flee to the mountains, and let them who are in the midst of it depart, and let them that are in the countries enter into it, and let not them that are in the countries, that means the other countries. In other words, don't be a tourist to Jerusalem at that time. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, and those that give suck in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon the people. Now, this same type of information, or this same type of prophecy, is given concerning the last time, or the Battle of Armageddon, when armies shall surround Jerusalem. But from the 24th verse, you're going to see that it's not speaking of that time. It's speaking of the time when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 A.D. We know this from verse 24, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations. Now you see, that's not going to happen at the next time that Jerusalem's going to be surrounded by the armies of the Antichrist. That's going to be the regathering. Here we have the final dispersion of Israel out of the land. Now notice, we're going to have our next until. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down by the Gentiles until, that's our second until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And there shall be signs in the sun and the moon, and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, and sea and waves roaring. Now this 25th verse is looking forward to the times of the end of the Gentiles. It's looking forward to the time when Antichrist is going to bring his armies against Jerusalem, and of course that's still future. But the verses that we had prior to this were speaking of the time when Jerusalem was made desolate by the Roman armies. Verse 26, men's heart failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Now there's two things we found out must happen before the kingdom can be ushered in. Number one, Israel as a nation must say, blessed be he that cometh in the name of the Lord. They must receive their Messiah. They must accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah. He cannot reign until Israel receives him. And that's not happened yet. That's why he's not reigning yet. And then he cannot come until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And you'll know that when Jerusalem is in complete control of its own destiny, when the Gentiles have no more control over what goes on in the land of Israel. You say, well, isn't that true now? No, it's not true. If Israel was to destroy that Gentile mosque that's on the relative site of the temple, the armies of the world would just march in there and turn them upside down. It would just be the excuse. And you see, even today we have the news that the nations of the world have voted against Israel. It's just if there was ever a sign of the times, you saw it in history today. And this is just going to progress, see. It's going to go on and get more so all the time. So the Gentiles are still oppressing Israel, aren't they? And we cannot say that Israel is in control of its own destiny. No, they can't even do anything unless the United States kind of gives them power to, you know. When the United States says, look, we won't send you any more arms till you retreat some more, or something like that, then they have to retreat, don't they? They have to, they're still trodden down by the Gentiles. The Gentiles are still making the decisions on what goes on in this world in counter-distinction to Israel carrying on its own destiny. So the times of the Gentiles are not yet. Well, what does this mean, the times of the Gentiles? Well, you see, God abandoned the world, the human race as a race, when he had given them two opportunities, one under Adam and one under Noah. And he says, the human race will not come to me. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pick out one man, and I'm going to give him a promise. And then through his seed, through his progeny, I'm going to bring the world back to me. And of course, he made that promise to Abraham. And then he told the descendants of Abraham that through Isaac and Jacob, that they would be the dominant force in the world, and that he would do all of his work in this world through them. But he says, if you turn from me, then I'll find another way to do my work, and that's why we're what we are. Because Israel was rejected by God as a nation 600 years before Christ because of their idolatry, when he sent a Gentile nation under Nebuchadnezzar to destroy their whole system of worship and rule and so forth. So the times of the Gentiles began when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem approximately 600 years before Christ. And the times of the Gentiles have extended on through our time and will extend on until the end of the tribulation, when Jesus Christ comes back and destroys the armies of the world at the Battle of Armageddon, which will mark the end of that period of time we call the Great Tribulation. And then the times of the Gentiles will be fulfilled. So what must happen? Number one, Jesus cannot rule until his own nation accepts him. That's first. Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. And Jesus cannot rule until Gentile rule has ceased to be. And the thing that will mark that is Jerusalem will no longer be downtrodden by the Gentiles. And that still has at least 7 years to go. Now, let's look for our third until, and we find that in the book of Romans, chapter 11. We found two untils, and here's the third one. Romans 11:25. For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceit, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Now here's your third until. Now, the times of the Gentiles and the fullness of the Gentiles is two entirely different things. The times of the Gentiles began with Nebuchadnezzar, and it's that period of human history when the Gentile nations are in control of the world. The fullness of the Gentiles speaks of that time when God will have completed his present program of calling out a people for his name from among the Gentiles. And that means the church. He cannot come and set up his kingdom till everybody is saved that's supposed to be saved from out of the nations of the world. And that's his program today. His program today is calling out a people for his name from among all of the nations, particularly the Gentile nations. And so the fullness of the Gentiles has not yet come. The very next person that's saved may bring that in. The very next person may bring in the fullness. That's what we're all waiting for. We're waiting for the fullness of the Gentiles. That is, when that great body that's made up of peoples from all the world shall be complete. And then can start the events will bring about the end. Now, some say the fullness of the Gentiles speaks of that time when the rapture takes place, and others say it speaks of the end of the tribulation. Well, now, I could give you all the reasons why it's the controversy is both ways, but we don't have time for that tonight. But anyway, we can be sure that as of right now, the fullness of the Gentiles have not yet come in, and Christ will not establish his rule in this world until that takes place. Now, we have some more, we're told that in the next few verses here in Romans 11. Then we have some more insight back in Acts 15. We'll read that. Let's read Romans 11:25 again. For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part. Now, the reason he says in part is because Jews are being saved today. And so we can't say that every Jew is blind, because some of them are coming to Christ. But he says blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, and so all Israel shall be saved. When? After the fullness of the Gentiles come in. As it is written, there shall come out of Zion a deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. That is the progeny of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For this is my covenant unto them when I shall take away their sins. So, the deliverer is not going to come out of Zion until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Let's look back one book, in the book of Acts, chapter 15, and we'll see Bishop James comment on this in the council that was held at Jerusalem some years after the resurrection of Christ. In Acts 15, verse 13, and after they had held their peace, James answered, saying, Men and brethren, hearken unto me. Simeon, that is Peter, hath declared how God at first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. That's what he's doing now, taking out a people from among the Gentiles for his name, and to this agree the words of the prophet as it is written. And here he's going to quote from Hosea. Isn't that it? Yes. And he's quoting from the prophet Hosea, chapter 3, verse 5, where he says, After this I will return, and will build again the tabernacle of David, which is fallen down, and I will build again its ruins, and I will set it up, that the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, saith the Lord, who doeth all these things. Now this phrase in verse 16, set it up, is quite interesting. It's a phrase that's used by the prophet Daniel in Daniel 2:44, and he makes it very clear that the kingdom is not going to be ushered in, as some would say. That is to say, we're not going to bring in the kingdom. The kingdom is going to be set up by God. That's the phrase that's used. And when is that going to be set up? It's going to be set up when the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. When he has finished gathering for himself a people for his name, then he will set up the kingdom under Christ. So you see your three untils? Christ will not set up his kingdom until he's received as king by the nation of Israel, until the Gentile nations no longer dominate Israel, and until he's completing calling out a people for his name from among the Gentiles. That's where we come in, of course. We're not literal descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, most of us aren't. Maybe one or two of us are. But most of us are not in that physical line at all. But we're in God's program, because that's what he's doing. He's calling out a people for his name from among the Gentiles. And he will continue to do that until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. So those are two different expressions. So I want you to be interested in pursuing those three untils. I suppose when we get to Luke chapter 21, we'll have to do that all over again, won't we? Because we'll come to that second until again, and somebody might be here then that's not here now. Well, we progress on now in Luke to chapter 14. And it came to pass, as he went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat on the Sabbath day, that they watched him. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had the dropsy. And Jesus answering spoke unto the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? Now here's why Christ had said that. Previous to this, there had been at least 6 definite chronicled accounts of Christ saving or healing individuals on the Sabbath day. Now he healed many more than 6 on the Sabbath days, because in some of the stories about him healing the sick, it goes on to say he did many more. Some examples of those he healed on the Sabbath day, for instance, would be the impotent there at the well or the pool of Siloam. At Bethesda. In the 5th chapter of John, remember? the one that was there and nobody would put him into the water? Well, he healed him on the Sabbath day. And then, in the 9th chapter of John, there was the one that was born blind, who was told to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. That's two different pools, public pools there in Jerusalem. In 5th chapter was the impotent by Bethesda. Is that the right name? If I got it right now? Yes. And in the 9th chapter, the one blind from birth that was sent to wash in the pool of Siloam. Those were two that were healed on the Sabbath. And in each case, Christ was reviled for doing that. Then we have had several previous accounts in Luke. For instance, we have the occasion of Peter's mother-in-law being healed. That was on the Sabbath day. And we're told that in the book of Luke, back, I believe, in the 4th chapter. And then on that same Sabbath day, he healed many others. And then in the 6th chapter, we have another account. And each time he was reviled. And then we found just recently in the 13th chapter. Now, on one occasion, when they reviled him and accused him of breaking the Sabbath, he speaks of if you had a little sheep that got lost in a pit or stumbled and went into a pit, wouldn't you pick him out on the Sabbath day? Well, if you do that for a sheep, why wouldn't you help some poor human being that's equally being bound? Another time, he said the same thing regarding an ox falling in a pit. Or we'll have that here. And then the other time it was, if your ox was thirsty, wouldn't you unloose him from his bonds and go take him to get some water on the Sabbath day? And he says, well, that's all I'm doing, only I'm doing it with human beings instead of with animals. So each time he came back with an answer. But here they are, almost at the end of his ministry, and having seen him healed many on the Sabbath day, and so now they're trying to find cause to put him to death. And wherewithal to accuse him, so they're watching him there. It says, the lawyers and the Pharisees, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? And they held their peace, and he took him and healed him and let him go. That is the one that had the dropsy. Verse 5, and answered them, saying, which of you shall have an ass or an ox fallen into a pit, and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him again to these things. He always answered them wisely, so that they had no real comeback. And as he was there in this house of the chief Pharisee on the Sabbath day, he told them a parable. He'd no doubt watched them come in, and each one wanting the most favored position, and he evidently was at the least of the positions. And he says in verse 7, he put forth a parable to those who were bidden to this particular supper to which he had been invited. And when he marked how they chose out the chief places, saying unto them, when thou art bidden by any man to a wedding, sit not down in the highest room or the chief seat, lest a more honorable man than thou be bidden of him. See, the way they had the places set, I guess it's a lot like our protocol today when the president has a big state dinner or something, or royalty has this. The person that's entertaining, the host, has to be very, very careful to seat them in the right order with the most important people closest to the real wheel, and the host, and then the others that are less important further away. And obviously everybody recognizes the fact that to be seated in the favored place is a mark of honor. And so he had these. He saw these come in, evidently scrambling for the highest places. So he says in verse 9, and he that bade thee and him come and say to thee, give this man place, and thou begin with shame to take the lowest seat. Well, what he's saying is that if you go up a little, if you think you're a bigger wheel than the host thinks you are, that you're liable to get pretty badly embarrassed, because he's liable to come and put you in what he thinks your place is, and take you out of what you think your place is, and then you'll be greatly embarrassed. Verse 10, but when thou art bidden, go and sit down in the lowest room, or the lowest seat, that when he that bade thee cometh, he may say unto thee, friend, go up higher. Then shalt thou have worship or honor in the presence of them that sit at meat with thee. The thought here is, if you sit in the very lowest seat, there's no chance in your being embarrassed by being put down, is there? And the least that could happen to you is that you'd be where you were. But if you're going to be moved at all, you'd be moved to a more favorable position. Now, the thought here is that the most honorable one there was Christ. And, you know, it's going to be a rather startling thing when these that were at that particular feast find out that they took a seat more honorable than the very Son of God. And I don't want to be in that position. And I don't know, the only thing I could think that would come close to that, if I were to go to heaven thinking I should be greatly exalted and somebody I thought was of no consequence in the work of God was given more honor. I don't want to have that. I'd rather... we have a friend down in Lakeland, in CBMC. He always says, you know, when he hears about a Christian leading somebody to Christ or something like that, he says, well, I guess I'm going to have to spend all of eternity looking at the back of his head. You know, guess he's going to have a more honorable place in glory than I am. But that's better than thinking you're going to be in the exalted place. He says in verse 11, for whosoever exalted himself shall be abased, and he that humbled himself shall be exalted. The way up is down, and the way down is up. There's another way to say this. Or the saying is, pride goeth before a fall. A haughty neck will be bowed. And this is a principle that we need to think of each day. Verse 12. Then said he also to him that bade him, when thou makest a dinner or a supper, call not thy friends, nor thy brethren, neither thy kinsmen, nor thy rich neighbors, lest they also bid thee again, and a recompense be made thee. But when thou makest a feast, call the poor, the maimed, the lame, and the blind, and thou shalt be blessed. For they cannot recompense thee, for thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just. Now, I don't know whether you ever thought of it, but we are the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind. We are those who've been bidden and have nothing with which to repay. The Lord has invited to us to the greatest banquet table that's ever going to be set. I mean, the greatest celebration it'll ever be. He's invited us, and we can't repay him, can we? He's gone out into the highways and the hedges and brought us in. And this would be comparable to some great, very wealthy personage just going out and inviting the lowest scum of the earth that they might come, because he would know they couldn't repay him. And we're in that same boat. We've been invited. And we must not disdain such an invitation as some who will be brought out later. But this verse 14 is a very interesting verse, because it brings forth a teaching that was first made very clear by the prophet Daniel, that there is not one big general resurrection. There are two resurrections. And he speaks here of the resurrection of the just. inferring two resurrections? Well, he's already previously, as recorded in John chapter 5, made it very clear that there are two resurrections. But hold your place here in Luke, and look for a moment with me back in Daniel, and I want to show you that the Old Testament, as well as the New, teaches two resurrections, not just one. And this, by the way, is not generally known, particularly among your mainline denominations. They teach that one great day in the future there's going to be a resurrection. But there's going to be two resurrections. Notice in Daniel chapter 12, first verse 1, and at that time. Well, that makes you ask what time, doesn't it? Well, it's talking about that time when the Antichrist shall set his palace in Jerusalem. Notice in verse 45 of Daniel 11, and he shall plant the tabernacle of his palace, he's talking about the Antichrist here, between the seas, that is, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea, in the glorious holy mountain, that's in Jerusalem, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Now, the time that's being spoken of is the time when Antichrist shall be brought to his knees. And that is the very last thing on the program before Christ comes back. So that's the time we're talking about in chapter 12. You see, God didn't divide the Bible up into chapters. Somebody did that several centuries ago to help referencing. And if you're going to get the plain story of the Bible, always start a verse or two before. If you want to read the 10th chapter of this book or that book, don't start with verse 1. Start with the 2 or 3 verses before that so that you can see the tie-in. And God never put a great big 12 here in between what we have is 11:45 and what we have is 12:1. It was all went right together. So he's talking about a particular time when the Antichrist shall come to his end. And he says, at that time, at what time? At that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince who standeth for the children of thy people. Now, the children of thy people, Daniel's people, are Israel. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time, and at that time thy people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book. Now what? He's talking about what time? The time that Antichrist shall come to his end, and the time just following the Great Tribulation, see, a time of trouble such as never was, and at the time that the people of Israel shall be delivered. That's when Christ comes back in glory. Now at that time, verse 2, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. That's the time when the Old Testament saints are going to be resurrected. That sets it for us. Some people want to know if the Old Testament saints will be resurrected at the rapture of the church. No, they will not be. They'll be resurrected at the end of the tribulation, just in time for the kingdom to be set up, at the same time that the tribulation saints will be resurrected. Now, we'll see this just in a moment. I just want you to see here, though, it says that some shall awake to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, Christ is going to comment on that in John chapter 5, and let's look there for a moment. In John chapter 5, verse 29, and shall come forth they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. There are two resurrections, a resurrection of life and a resurrection of damnation. That's taught in the Old and the New Testament. Now, we have to go all the way to the 20th chapter of Revelation to find out how far apart those two resurrections are. They don't come close together, and we find that in Revelation chapter 20. in Revelation 20, verse 5. But the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection, that is, those that were resurrected before the 1,000 years. Blessed and holy is he that hath part in the first resurrection. On such the second death hath no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. So let's put this all together. Daniel says that some shall awake unto rewards and glory, and some shall awake unto contempt. John tells us that some shall be resurrected unto life, and some shall be resurrected unto damnation. John tells us in Revelation that at the beginning of the 1,000 years, or before the 1,000 years begins, that those who are blessed shall be resurrected, and at the end of the 1,000 years, those that are not blessed will be resurrected. So there's 1,000 years between the first resurrection and the second resurrection. Everybody in the first resurrection will be saved people. Everybody in the second resurrection will be unsaved people. Now that's the big difference. And these two resurrections will be 1,000 years apart. Now this is what confuses a lot of people. The first resurrection, that is the resurrection of the just, is in 3 stages. And we're told this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which is the resurrection chapter, and it tells us that the resurrection of the just, or the first resurrection, is like a harvest. That Christ, and each one has to come in his own order, that Christ is the first fruits. Then we who remain are his at his coming, we're the main harvest. And then at the end time is the gleanings. So you put that all together, and here's what you have. Well, first let's talk about a harvest. Now, I grew up in North Florida, and you had, as money crops, you had watermelons, and you had cotton, and many other things, but just take those 2 crops. If a fellow had watermelons, what he would do, he would go all through his patch early in the season looking for a few melons that might be ripe enough to pick, because if he could find them, he'd get much more for them than when everybody had their harvest coming in. You see, you get much higher pay for your first fruits. And then he would pick those that got ripe first, and then he would, the same thing was with cotton now, back before you did all the cotton with mechanical pickers, but back in the old days when you picked cotton for 50 cents a day or a penny a pound. I don't know if anybody ever picked cotton for that, but I know all about that, picking cotton for a penny a pound. You ever pick cotton?
I tried it one time. I didn't get very many pounds.
Didn't get very many pounds. Well,
I couldn't get it out of the boat.
at a penny a pound, it takes a pretty good cotton picker to make 75 cents in a day.
40 cents a 100.
40 cents a 100? Well, you see, that just tells you that you lived a little before I did, you see, Brother Pink. When I got along, they was paying $1 a 100. But I never picked 100 pounds in a day, did you? My goodness, you better picker than I thought you looked like a cotton picker. I tell you, I want to bow to a better cotton picker than me. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, if you got 40 cents a 100 and you picked 200 pounds, you earned 80 cents the hard way.
Well, we had got a hand down the farm that picked 300 pounds.
Where did you grow up?
South Carolina.
Oh, well, that's different. You see, up there they got that good old black soil down. I came from the sandy soils of North Florida, and boy, they just it didn't grow that good, you know. But anyhow, they'd go out in the cotton fields, just like in the watermelon fields, and some of the cotton would come out in its bowls a little early, and they'd go pick that cotton first, so they'd get a higher price for it. And then they'd pick the main harvest, and then 3 or 4 weeks later, they'd go and clean up the rest, wouldn't they, Brother Payne? What little bit was left over, you know, and they'd pick that. That was the gleanings. So a harvest has always been made of three parts: the first fruits, the main harvest, and the gleanings. And this is like the first resurrection is going to be. Jesus is the first fruits, we're the main harvest, and then at the end of the tribulation, the Old Testament saints, along with the tribulation saints, are the gleanings. That's all part of the first. That's all part of the first resurrection. And then it'll be 1,000 years before the second resurrection, which is the resurrection of the unjust. Now, the reason I bring that out is because here, right in the middle of this story, and this is a good thing for you to remember. God does this. He tucks a truth away in an unobtrusive way, in an obscure way, in another story. Now, we read over this 14th verse of the 14th chapter of Luke almost as though it weren't there, don't we? Because it's just part of that story about taking the wrong place at the supper. But look at the truth he teaches there. Verse 14 again. And thou shalt be blessed, for they cannot recompense thee, for thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just. The resurrection of the just is a time of great reward. And the Lord goes through this over and over again. Now, I was scheduled to do this next parable that was on the same day in the same Pharisee's house, beginning in verse 15, but we wouldn't have time to do that justice between now and time to quit. So instead of that, let's just look at a few more of these verses which say the same thing that this one does. For thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just. There's a future time of rewards coming. Now, all through the Bible, there is a major theme, and that is God's program of rewards. Now, we tend to treat that rather lightly. How often I hear Christians say, I don't care anything about rewards. I just want to do whatever I can in the church work and so forth, and I'll let the rewards take care of themselves. I'm not interested in rewards. Well, you know, to say that is, I know that most of the people say that, they don't realize, but what they're saying is, I'm not interested in what God's interested in. Because God is very interested in rewards. If you want a revelation along those lines, just read the Sermon on the Mount. Now, probably those three chapters in Matthew, 5, 6, and 7, are as well known as any scriptures. And you count the number of times in the Sermon on the Mount that Christ speaks of the future rewards. Let's look a moment. He's talking about the recompense of the resurrection of the just. Let's look for a moment at the last chapter of Revelation. Verse 12. Revelation 22:12. And behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me. Did you know that little phrase right there, my reward is with me, is in the Bible a number of times, twice? In the book of Isaiah, for instance. Behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me to give every man according to his works. This is a very important subject with Christ. And I'll try to explain why, but let me show you one or two other scriptures. For instance, Revelation chapter 3, verse 10. Verse 11. Revelation 3:11, behold, I come quickly, hold that fast which thou hast, that no man take thy crown. You can lose your reward. Or look at the little book of 2 John, verse 8. Look to yourselves that we lose not those things which we have wrought, but that we receive a full reward. That seems to be a very important thing, receiving a full reward. One other place in the book of Hebrews, chapter 10. Verse 13. Cast not away therefore your confidence, which hath great recompense of reward. Great recompense of reward. Now just one in the Old Testament to show you that this, and it's just as much a subject in the Old Testament as it is in the New. Psalm 19. He's speaking, he's exalting the Word of God. And look what he says about the Word of God in Psalm 19, verse 10. More to be desired are they, that is the words of God, than gold, yea, than much fine gold, also than honey and the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is thy servant warned, and in keeping of them there is great reward. Abraham was told, don't take your rewards on earth. God will be your exceeding great reward. When God uses an adjective to describe this matter of rewards, it's always a superlative adjective. And as I direct you to the Sermon on the Mount, right at the end of the Beatitudes, when he says blessed and blessed and blessed, and then he uses this phrase, great is your reward when you endure persecution. And that's a superlative word. That's a word which means beyond anything you could think of. And remember when he says, for a cold cup of water given in his name, there shall be a reward. Now, why is this subject of reward so important to God? Well, it's the only basis upon which he can treat us differently throughout the eternal ages. You see, God loves us all the same, doesn't he? He loves everybody in this room exactly the same. But he doesn't want to treat us all the same. He doesn't want us to all be just alike. He wants to treat us differently. He wants to give more privilege to one. And so he has a program going on in this world which will form the basis by which he can reward some greater than others. You say, well, that's not fair. Well, let's make an analogy. Let's suppose that I have two sons. And let's suppose that they both want to be doctors. And they've expressed this all the way through their high school years and so forth. They both want. I have two sons, and they don't want to be doctors, but I'm making an analogy here. Let's suppose they want to be doctors. And so let's suppose that they're equally bright, except one of them applies himself, and the other one doesn't. And so one of them makes good grades, and he's readily accepted into pre-med school. The other one makes very poor grades, and the school won't accept him. They say, no, you can't be a doctor. You don't, and he can't find any pre-med school that'll accept him. Then suppose that one comes to me and says, well, Dad, says you mustn't send my brother to pre-med school so that he can be a doctor. And I said, why not? Because I can't go, and if you send him, it'll show that you love him more than you love me. Now, you see, that would be a false conclusion, wouldn't it? Because, you see, we can all see that. One earned the basis upon which he could be sent to the medical school, and the other one didn't. Well, this is what God's system of rewards is all about. Some will earn a basis upon which he can shower more privilege and pour out his great heart more. He'll have a basis for doing it. And he can't do it without a basis. Now, he can save all of us and take us into heaven on the basis of what Jesus Christ earned for us on Calvary's cross. That's no problem. But the problem is, he would have to treat us all exactly the same once we reached heaven's portals for all of eternity, because he loves us the same. It would be against his character to treat us differently. So he devised a system whereby he could receive fulfillment. And so his program of rewards is his program, and it's very close to his heart, and he thinks very highly of it. And when we disdain it, we don't understand his program. We just don't understand the mind of God at all. To speak lightly about, I don't care about rewards. Who cares about crowns and all? I'm not the least bit interested in all. And I just do like that when I hear Christians say that. And a lot of them say that. You know, that doesn't interest me. That doesn't interest me a bit. Well, they ought to just know more about their God and what he's doing and why he's doing it. And they couldn't possibly say a thing like that. So this is a subject that's very much on his heart, and we ought to learn about it, and we ought to find out. I've been working with the junior high young people at the church that I attend in Lakeland for the past several months, and we're studying the crowns and how to win the crowns and what purpose God has in those crowns, and they really enjoy that. I've never seen that in any Sunday school material, and it's the type of thing that really interests a young teenager. I don't know why we manage in our Sunday school material to weed out most of that which young people find the most interesting, and just keep beating them over the head with the same things year after year after year, and bore them to death till by the time they're in high school they don't want anything to do with it. It's an amazing thing how we can be successful at that. But that's what we do. But there's a lot of things in the Bible that really intrigues young people. I mean, really gets them all excited. And to where they just want to come back and hear about it again. And we ought to have our minds tuned that way. It's time to quit. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you again for all the wonderful truths that there are in this thy book. And we pray we would apply our hearts to this which thou hast said in Jesus' name. Amen.